Noreena Hertz, you wrote about loneliness. How has loneliness changed in recent decades? Are people, I don't know, today more lonely than they were half a century ago? And what are the major causes that have changed this paradigm in which we think and talk about loneliness?
Great questions. And yes, your viewers and readers may not be aware of the extent to which loneliness has been increasing over the past few decades. We know this because loneliness started being measured properly by social scientists back in the 1970s. So we have a lot of data from the 1970s onwards that we can compare. And what's clear is that over the past 50 years, progressively, and then accelerating really since about 2010, we've seen loneliness rise to a very considerable degree. I mean, in the United States, 1 in 5 millennials doesn't have a single friend at all. In the United Kingdom, 2 in 5 under 25s are lonely always or often. And in the United Kingdom, 2 in 5 pensioners don't have a single pet, whilst here in Romania, 1/3 of the population feel lonely often or always, 1/3, with 16% feeling lonely all or most of the time. Actually, Romania is one of the loneliest countries in Europe, it turns out, unfortunately. But basically, this is a global crisis. And you asked why, like what's been going on? Great question. So I think there's a number of factors at play here. Firstly, we just do less with other people than we did in the past. We're less likely to go to church. We're less likely to be members of trade unions. We're less likely to be members of our children's parent-teacher associations. So we just do less. And this is a steady trend we've seen globally. Then, of course, there's urbanization and the challenges that brings. It's not that cities are necessarily lonelier than rural communities, but what urbanization does is it means that people in rural communities often feel left behind, left alone. And people in cities are often lonely because they don't have the infrastructure and the social support systems in the new place that they move. Then, of course, another factor, an important reason why we've become so lonely over the past few decades, especially, is what I would argue is the neoliberal mindset. And by that, I mean the kind of ideology that really took hold in the West from the 1980s, elsewhere since the fall of the Berlin Wall, where basically one kind of economic orthodoxy really took hold across the world called neoliberal economics. And this economic paradigm really didn't only change how businesses interacted and how the economy was run, but it also changed how we saw ourselves and what qualities we valued in ourselves and each other. The neoliberal mindset is one in which we value qualities like competitiveness, and aggression, and hustle at the expense of qualities like collaboration and helping and sharing. And really, we see this where even in pop song lyrics, where since the 1980s, we see words such as we, us, and our being steadily supplanted by words such as I, me, myself. So part of it is that we became much more self-focused, self-interested, and stopped valuing connection and collaboration. And then, of course, there's our phones. And I say, of course, because what we see is very, very clearly from about 2012, which is when people really started adopting smartphones en masse, especially adopting social media. That's when we see loneliness levels really starting to shoot up, especially amongst the young. I began my research not clear as to whether there was a relationship between loneliness and social media, because of course, counterintuitively, you might think that social media makes you feel more connected, but actually the research is really clear. In many ways, I believe social media is the tobacco industry of the 21st century and needs to be regulated as such because of the damage it's doing to our mental health, especially amongst the young. And when I interviewed young people, you know, they'd tell me their stories of how they would post on Instagram and then be waiting, hoping for somebody to like one of their posts. And when they didn't, feel devastated, so alone, so excluded and isolated. Or teenagers who said that their friends had told them they weren't going out after school, and then they were on their phone and they saw their friends posting on social media, and they felt so isolated and alone. It wasn't that, of course, kids couldn't have been excluded in the past. It's just in the past, an adult in their lives would probably have seen that they were being excluded and could have intervened. And also the shame of exclusion and isolation haunts them 24/7. So phones, the fact we do less with each other, urbanization, what I call the neoliberal mindset, and then the pandemic, of course, creating its own set of issues around loneliness, making people, you know, feel and be, of course, more isolated, and also accelerating our move to digital living. So accelerating that move to ordering your food on an app rather than going to a cafe, doing your yoga on Zoom rather than going to a class, and thereby depriving us of those face-to-face interactions, which are so important in helping us feel connected.
For empathy, for expressing feelings. There is a big paradox here, because as the power of social media increases and the more friends are on your list, because almost all social media accounts have now at least a few hundred of friends. You don't have a few friends, you have hundreds of friends. The more the atomization of the individual and social loneliness increase. Is social media a tool of social atomization?
Yes, I mean, I think it does two things. First of all, it creates, as you say, there is a paradox in some ways, because you have this bigger number of friends, but the friendships are of a superficial bent. I mean, you know, if you look at your Facebook friends, how many of them would you be able to phone up in a time of need or get help from? Probably very few. So there is a kind of superficiality of the friendship, I think, is one problem. And then, of course, there's the atomization and fragmentation that social media accelerates, partly because the tone on social media tends to be so vicious and angry and toxic that it often, just by witnessing it, makes you feel more isolated and alone, because you feel detached from this horrible world that you're witnessing. But also because in, unfortunately, a high percentage of cases, people actually experience some sort of abuse or bullying on social media, especially the young people, especially the young. A third of British female students, for example, have experienced abuse on social media. So, and if you're directly getting abuse, well, of course, you're going to feel more disconnected. So, but social media doing a third thing as well, making us feel increasingly disconnected from our fellow citizens because of the fact that it thrives on division and divisiveness. We also feel increasingly disconnected from those around us. So lonely, not only in the sense of feeling disconnected from friends and family, but also lonely in that sense of feeling disconnected from our fellow citizens.
So loneliness, as you say, is not limited to not having friends, but also implies this feeling of social non-belonging. I would like you to explain a little bit this feeling. Where does it come from and what does it lead to?
Where does loneliness come from?
This feeling of social non-belonging.
So we are creatures of togetherness. It's built in our kind of evolutionary past, deep in our evolutionary past, that we should be with other people and we shouldn't feel alone. If you think about cavemen, you know, they were hunting and gathering in tribes that were forming communities for their own survival. So when we feel that we don't belong, when we feel alone, it's actually a feeling that is profoundly painful. Painful mentally, and we do see a link between loneliness and mental pain, anxiety, depression, but also also painful physically. So loneliness, we know, actually damages our physical health as well. Our heart rate goes up when we feel lonely. Our blood pressure goes up. Our levels of cortisol go up. All of them signaling to our body, don't be alone, and actually having a very damaging health effect. Loneliness is as bad for our health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's incredible, really, and we don't even think about it. So this feeling of not belonging is a very painful feeling. And the consequences are profound. I mean, profound, I've talked about the health consequences. Profound for the economy. Lonely workers are less motivated, less productive, more likely to quit than workers who don't feel lonely, but also with implications for our democracy. And it was actually my research into the rise of right-wing populism across the world that that was how I realized this. I wanted to understand, this is a few years ago now, why people were voting for politicians like Donald Trump, or for Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, or for La Ligue in Italy, or for Le Pen in France. I wanted to understand what was going on there. And I interviewed people who were voting for these politicians across the world. And one thing that kept on coming across from their stories was how lonely they were, how disconnected they felt, how isolated and invisible they felt or had felt until they found community and belonging in parties of the far right. Parties who have, in many ways, weaponized community and preyed upon the lonely. Parties that deliver typically a spectacle, a theater of community. If we think about Donald Trump's rallies, if we remember back, and everyone wearing the same hats and chanting the same songs. So really playing and preying on these lonely people. And the empirical research, the scientific data, also supports this theory, because we know, for example, that Hillary Clinton voters were much more likely to have friends than Donald Trump voters. We know that Le Pen voters were less likely to have friends than people who were voting for centrist parties in France. So, so loneliness making one more prone to reaching out to political parties who overtly deliver community. And there's no reason why centrist parties shouldn't deliver that. It's just that they haven't been. And it's typically far-right parties who've been delivering this, or at least the rhetoric of belonging and community the most. And they've also done something else very effectively. They've played to this other aspect of loneliness, which is that when we're lonely, we also tend to see the world as a more hostile and threatening place. It's partly because of the fight and flight kind of physiological response that happens to our body when we are lonely. So when we're lonely, we have these feelings which are like fight or flight feelings, and we see the world on average as a more threatening place. And of course, far-right-wing politicians are playing to that as well. So, you know, speaking to this sense of unbelonging and promising you can belong with us, and these awful other people, you know, who are threatening you will be excluded. And in different countries, you know, politicians choose different others, whether it's immigrants, whether it's women, whether it's people of, you know, different colors, you know, but it's a familiar trope. Yeah. So loneliness affecting our democracy, our economy, and our health, physical and mental.
Yeah, but how can liberalism respond? Because it's easier to speculate people's fears. It's easier to say, make America great again, than to have a good, a real strategy. How can we respond to populism?
I think the first thing is we have to recognize people of a kind of liberal and centrist sentiment have to realize that some of the grievances of people who've been voting for these parties are actually legitimate. and need to be acknowledged. I mean, the reality is there are a lot of people who have felt ignored, isolated,
irrelevant,
unseen by traditional politicians. And we've got to acknowledge that. We've all got to acknowledge that. So that's the first step. Second is actually seeking to meaningfully address some of their concerns and needs. So it's partly about seeing them. It's partly about doing things. It's about how we prioritize, how we spend money, which matters. It's about thinking about the fact that there is a relationship often between this feeling of exclusion and unbelonging and economic circumstance, and recognizing that, but also recognizing that part of the problem here is that there's also been a steady defunding by governments across the world, including in Romania, of what I call the infrastructure of community over the past few decades, a defunding of public libraries, of public parks, of youth clubs, of community centers. People need physical spaces where they can come together and do things together. And that's something that parties of all stripes need to recognize and refund as a matter of urgency. There need to be these secular, non-partisan spaces where people can hang out and do things. The other thing governments need to do is take on social media. I mean, this is absolutely essential and can be done. In fact, the United Kingdom, with a conservative government, is leading the way here with new legislation that's about to be introduced, the online safety bill, which is going to put much more responsibilities and obligations on social media companies than they've had to date, and will impose fines and also personal responsibility on directors for infringing them. The European Union is considering similar legislation, as is Sweden. So, what can Romanian politicians be doing in this regard is something to consider. So I think there's actually a lot that politicians can do to speak to the constituency who have been turning to right populist politicians in a meaningful way. I mean, a lot. But it's about recognizing that this group does need acknowledging, tending and caring for, and at the same time doing something to stop the misinformation, disinformation and hate that social media is promulgating, which is definitely increasingly part of the problem, not just of course for loneliness, but when it comes to democracy itself more generally.
In Romania, but not only in Romania, most traditional parties find easier to imitate a populist party, like in Romania, look, Alliance for Romanian Unity. That's a populist name. Than to be a real alternative.
I mean, we saw the same thing here, of course, I'm speaking in the United Kingdom. So we saw the same thing here in the United Kingdom when the Conservative Party, really under the leadership of Boris Johnson, really, became a very right populist party under his reign, with the tragedy that ended up being Brexit, a vote which now 4 in 5 Brits say that they wish hadn't happened. So, I can see it's easy wins, isn't it, to humanize others. But we the citizenry need to kind of be clear that we don't want this and that we won't accept it. And we need brave, visionary politicians who recognize the short-termism in these false promises and in these strategies that ultimately don't deliver in economic terms or social terms. So, we need a combination of both. We need bravery, visionary, and we need us citizens saying, no, we're not going to vote for these people. We are part of the solution. Of course we are.
There will be important elections next year, European elections, but to put our hope in politicians could not be the best strategy.
Yes. We must never only put our hope in politicians, for sure. And, I think with all these critical subjects, we need to think on with different strategies and different strategic hats at the same time. So yes, there is a role that government can and should play here, there's also a role that business can and should play here. I mean, if we think about loneliness is a real problem for businesses, given the impact on productivity and motivation and engagement. So I think the important thing for businesses to recognize is that there's a cost of loneliness in the workplace and actually do something about it. And the encouraging news is that since my book came out, and it's I'm fortunate for it to have been a big global bestseller, I'm being approached by companies all over the world who are recognizing this and are actually putting in place now very tangible steps to make their employees feel more connected. So that's great. And then, of course, there's us. What can we do as individuals? That's so critical, to recognize that there's so much we can do. So much we can do to help alleviate loneliness kind of in our communities. We have to think about things like our local shops, our independent shops, and acknowledge the roles that they play in anchoring and nurturing our communities, and push back against that temptation to, I don't know, order a book online rather than go to a bookshop, or order something on an app rather than go to a cafe, and really support our local cafes. So, we can support our local communities much more actively. We can volunteer and do things for and in our local communities much more consciously as well. We can try and fight our social media addiction. I actually take a digital Sabbath 1 day a week. I put my phone away so that I can be more present with those around me. It's tough, but I do it. We can just ourselves also think harder about some of those qualities that as a society we haven't been valuing in recent years: kindness, empathy, thinking about others, reciprocity, and think harder about how we're going to practice those skills ourselves. So, and when it comes to others, this demonization of the other that you were kind of referring to, that you're seeing in Romania as we're seeing elsewhere, I think if this matters to you, if this is something that matters to you, spend time with the other. There was a brilliant scheme done in Germany that I write about in my book by a newspaper, which actually paired up across Germany people with very different political views. So people who were anti-immigrants with people who were pro-immigrants, people who were anti-feminists with feminists, all different types of people. And what was fascinating, people who signed up, all they had to commit to was a 2-hour meeting with this other person face to face. And after a 2-hour meeting, their feelings about the other were profoundly different. They said that they much more understood their point of view. They said that they'd be much more willing to have a person like that as a friend. They said that they really saw the things that they had in common, not only the things they didn't share. So, if the kind of other conversation is worrying to you, you're finding it disturbing, one thing to do is to try and humanize your relationships with people who are different to you, because that goes a long way, a surprisingly long way as well.
So we can live together if we can have a real conversation between us. If not, there will always be a politician to point the other like a scapegoat.
Yes, and we, my gosh, we mustn't allow ourselves to be duped by these politicians and their kind of snake oil. I mean, we need to recognize that our interests are not always aligned with theirs, often are not aligned with theirs. And, be smart as to what we believe and trust that is coming out of their mouths, especially when they're in campaign mode, and make our own choices ourselves, thinking about the kind of world we want to live in, and of course the kind of world, the legacy we want to leave for our children and our children's children.
Would you say that Brexit is a consequence of this loneliness?
I think in many ways it is, because it's that same group of people who voted for Trump and voting for Le Pen, the same group of people who felt ignored, isolated, unseen, who disproportionately voted for Brexit. And as I said, now the vast majority of these people regret their decision. I mean, the UK is in a terrible economic situation now. We are, you know, the poor country now of the G7, and Brexit is absolutely unequivocally to blame here.
Mm-hmm. So we live in this era of high social anxiety. The pandemic, the war in Ukraine, the accelerated evolution of artificial intelligence. How do we reconnect in this context and at the same time integrating technological advances? Because a robot that keeps lonely elderly people company is not always a negative character. It has some positive values.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I don't want for a second for you, the viewer, to think that I'm anti-technology, because I'm not. And actually in my book, I write about some very moving stories in Japan where elderly care, where robots are used quite a lot now for elderly care, of elderly women knitting bonnets for their robot carers because they've become so attached to them. I do think that robots and technology actually does have a role to play in helping alleviate loneliness, especially given the advances in artificial intelligence, which mean that the robot will increasingly seem human in your interactions with it. So I'm not anti-technology at all. But it's about recognizing the limits of technology. It's about recognizing what still needs to be human. And it's also about recognizing this, that whilst robots, for example, may alleviate loneliness at the individual level, if we all were to subcontract care and compassion to robots, I'm worried about what that would do to society as a whole if we weren't forced to practice those skills of caring for an elderly relative or being kind to a friend. If all of that could be subcontracted, my fear is that we as a humanity would lose those skills. So I'm all for technology. I can see its implications and advantages at an individual level, but I think at the same time, absolutely crucial, even more crucial, I would argue, is us continuing to practice, nurture and nourish in-person, face-to-face interactions. And this is actually especially true of the young, of children. You know, one of the really worrying things that we've seen over the past few years, accelerated by the pandemic, is young children arriving at school age 5 or 6, lacking the most basic social skills, mainly because their parents are spending so much time on their phones that they're not imparting that basic education of how to socialize to their children. And so, you know, technology, an asset, but also if we don't use it very wisely, can be incredibly damaging for society and our lives.
Yeah, I saw this on the young generation, a lack of empathy and also an increase of anxiety because of the pandemic and because of this online school.
Yes, and you know, I mean, the young people I speak to, the figures are heartbreaking. The percentage of girls who self-harm in the United Kingdom, I've looked at those figures recently. I mean, terrible. So, you know, especially for the young, face-to-face, in-person interactions, doing things together. If you're a parent, doing things off-screen with your kids, encouraging them to do face-to-face meetings with their friends, sports with their friends, drama activities with their friends, singing with their friends. You know, the more we can do in person with others, the less lonely we'll be, and the more we'll practice these skills that actually are crucial for society as a whole.
Thank you very much, Noreena Hertz, for your book and for this dialogue.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.